Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Engaging Surveys Smartees webinar. My name is Natalie, and I'll be the host for this day webinar. Before I introduce our presenter for today, let me guide you through some practical details. When you have some questions during the presentation, you can ask them in the community chat on the left, and after the presentation, we will pick them up and answer them. It's also good to know how to use the agree and disagree buttons because you'll need them in the beginning of the presentation. When you take a look at the top of your screen, you can see a sign of a man raising his hand. And when you click on the arrow next to that sign, you'll see some different options like the agree and disagree option. And it's these two options you will need in the beginning of the presentation. So let's move on to the presentation, and our presenter for today is Katia Pallini. She's a research consultant here at InSites Consulting, but over the last year, she's been part of our R&D team, where her focus mainly is on the innovation within survey research. But she will tell you a lot more about that, so I'll pass the word to you, Katia.
Yes, thank you, Natalie, for this introduction. And also from my side, I would like to welcome everyone on this Smartees webinar on engaging surveys. So as Natalie mentioned, my name is Katia. I'm very passionate about consumer behavior, marketing, and of course also marketing research. I joined InSites Consulting as a quantitative research consultant, and today I'm working for the Forward R&D team here at InSites on survey innovation. And for you to know, also my personal interests are cooking and of course eating and spending times with my friends. So today we're going to talk about engaging surveys, but if we look at the innovations that took place in the past years in our industry, the majority of changes took place in the field of qualitative research. And besides the shift from offline to online, survey research has been the same for pretty much the past decades. And so my question to you before we start off, I would like to know whether or not you believe that this is the end of survey research. And do you believe that survey research is a dead end and we as an industry should move on to other research methods? So I know we're going to talk about surveys, but I would like you to think about this question and use the voting buttons that Natalie introduced also in the beginning. If you agree with the statement that surveys are the end, please use the agree button. If you disagree, also use the disagree button. And please use your own perspective in this. And I think both answers are right. There's nothing right or wrong here. So I'm really interested to see what you think about this. So I'm just gonna wait one more second because the votings are coming in. And yeah. Okay, for now I see votings coming in and I see that the majority of you disagrees with the fact that surveys are the end and that we need to think of other ways. But I also see some of you who agree with the statement, and I hope for both groups I can prove that this is for sure not the end of surveys. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is also what we see when we look at the world out there and our industry. Still 76% of all research projects conducted worldwide are in the field of quantitative research. And this comes from ESOMAR, their report in 2012. So surveys are still big today. However, we need to remind ourselves we need to level up every day in order to keep improving. And that's where we at InSites, we put two challenges up front, where we think of, okay, how can we level up surveys and what do we need to do to bring surveys to the future? And the first key challenge is to better engage participants. The second one is to capture that complex consumer reality. And let me tap into each one of them. So to better engage participants, well, the first thing that we need to understand is that online surveys are part of an engaging environment. Online, everything is fun, everything is gamified, interactive. But if we think of filling out surveys, it's not that an engaging activity, is it? And we need to understand that participants are basically always one step away to exit our surveys. Next, we're struggling more and more in our industry to attract participants for our research projects, and response rates are declining while we still need to think about our core and maintain high data quality. So we need to better understand how we can engage participants more in survey research, because engaging participants will better contribute to research and provide our better and richer answers. Now, before we can understand that concept of engagement, we need to tap into the concept of motivation. And this is where the theory of self-determination comes in, that shows us that motivation is not a fixed state, but it's rather a continuum going from on one side a motivation, and then all the way on the other side you have intrinsic motivation. Now, intrinsic motivation is of course the ideal state. Here people are engaged in an activity because of internal factors and are therefore more likely to sustain the activity for their own reasons. Then in the middle you have extrinsic motivations, where people are mainly driven by external factors. And of course it's a less preferred state compared to the intrinsic motivation. And on the left-hand side, you have aim motivation, where there's a complete absence of motivation, which of course causes that the task is not done or not done properly. And if we think about where traditionally participants of research are located, I could say that they're right here, where they're mainly driven by external factors, for example, like incentives. But of course, if I ask you where do we would like to see participants, well, of course, we would like to see them all the way up to here, where they're mainly driven by those internal factors. And so the goal of market research is to move that motivation of participants all the way to the right-hand side. Now, a second challenge in order to understand how we can think about the future of the survey of the future is to better capture that complex consumer reality. Because in the end, we want surveys to mirror the world out there, and we need to get answers. And as you know, the real world, as I would call it, is rather complex, and there are three dimensions that we need to take into account. Well, the first one is all about the social context. Well, consumer decisions are always taken in a social setting. For example, you might walk in store and buy a particular brand just because unconsciously you saw a person before you also buying that brand, or maybe you were just having dinner the other day at a friend's house and that brand was on the table. Or it could also be on a conscious level because someone from your household is joining on you on your shopping trip and they have a preference or they pick out that brand. However, today in survey research, we do not recognize that social dimension. And surveys are today a rather asocial activity where participants enter the survey to answer one question after another without being able to connect and reflect with other participants. Next to the social dimension, we need to understand that in reality, a lot of decisions are taken in a certain context or occasion. For example, when we're in store, at home, when we're hungry, and it's important to grasp what the context is that consumers are in when they are taking a decision, for example, consuming your product or using your product or making choices. And an answer to a question might not be as simple as yes or no, but might be explained by yes when or yes because. So we need to understand that context is a better predictor of consumer behavior than individual characteristics. The third dimension of that complex consumer reality is that we need to understand that the majority of our decisions are made quickly, automatically, intuitively, using our so-called System 1 thinking. And only less than 5% of our decisions are taken by that System 2 thinking, which is more deliberate and rational and requires a lot of effort. Now, traditional marketing and marketing research is quite firmly rooted in the idea that we influence people through that System 2 thinking. Because, for example, we give participants a list of brand benefits and we expect them to rate them each rationally in order to evaluate then the overall brand performance. However, you all know that the movement around behavioral economics shows us that we think much less than we think. And people use heuristics in their daily decision making. And one of these heuristics are emotions. Our decisions are wired by emotions. So when having to choose out of a set of options, we use our emotions to guide and simplify our decision making. So the next question is, I showed you the two challenges. So first we had to better engage participants, and then the next challenge was to grasp that complex consumer reality where we had that social dimension, context, and that we're not rational thinkers at all. So how can we make this happen in the end? Well, I'm gonna show you how we made it happen for each of these challenges. So for the first challenge, to better engage participants, we created a set of tools and tactics to help move participant motivation on that continuum. This is of course the continuum I showed you here. And what I'm going to show you, this theory also shows that there are 4 dimensions that you can tap into in order to move participant motivation. And the first one is autonomy, then you have competence, relatedness, and the fourth is value. Now, at InSites Consulting, we worked on 2 test projects, which I would like to share results with here in this webinar today. And one test project was with eBay, which ran in the UK, which was a UNA study. And then we also did a project for Cloetta. Cloetta is a chocolate and candy manufacturing company. And for them, we did an insight validation test on chocolate. And that study ran in Italy and in Sweden. And so in the next, I would like to tap into each and one of these 4 dimensions and show you some examples on how you can use these and which tools we used in these test projects in order to move participants' motivation on that continuum. So the first aspect that can help move the level of motivation is autonomy, allowing participants to choose to do something or not to do something. Now, traditionally, when participants enter a survey, they get one screen after another with loads of questions. It's like this tunnel they're entering, and it's question after question after question, and then we say thank you and goodbye. Now, in both test projects, we introduced the concept of modularity at the participant side. Now, what does this mean? Well, we divided the survey into different modules, and behind every module, you have a subset of questions. Now, when participants filled out the module, they were able to unlock another module and continue that way throughout the survey. Now, combining this modular approach with a nice layout, participants have the feeling that it's a nonlinear survey and that they can choose where they want to go. Next, it also allows them to get some feeling of control because they know there are, for example, 5 modules in a survey and they already completed 3 of them. Another example of autonomy, where you allow participants to choose to do something or not to do something, is by something that we call an optional second survey dimension. Now, today, we don't allow participants who are topic, brand, or experience engaged to move on beyond that traditional survey participation and enter a next collaboration dimension. However, we need to understand that there are participants out there who are really engaged and who want to help out brands and researchers on an additional collaboration dimension. And this is why we created this concept called the village. Well, as you can see also on your screen, basically it's a virtual village, and you have different buildings, and behind every building you have different task-based elements. For example, in one building you can connect with one another, you can give feedback on the survey, you can ask questions to the researcher. In another building you can write a review, in another you can post pictures, and so on. Now, the autonomy aspect here lies in the fact that this village concept is optional, meaning that participants who finish the regular survey can choose whether or not they want to enter the second collaboration dimension, and participate in different additional tasks. Next example of autonomy here is that this village is open for about 2 to 3 weeks after their initial survey participation. And so participants can always come back whenever they want to, and they can see what other people have written. They can also see comment on other people's work, complete additional challenges, and so on. So besides autonomy, there's also the concept of competence, showing participants that they're good at this, which also helps move that participant motivation on that continuum. And what you need to understand is that this village concept that I talked about is nothing like a research community. So we do not work with moderators who actively manage the online conversations. So here we opted for a very light moderation level which focuses on problem solving. So the task here of the moderator was to make sure that people who were experiencing technical issues were helped out. So for the ePay project, which ran in the UK, I could take up that role. However, for the Cloetta project, which ran in Italy and in Sweden, there was kind of a language barrier there. So what we did is that we invited our own enthusiastic panel member, two of them, we invited them to become and take up that moderator role. Now, these people were really excited because we showed them we believe that you can do a good job, and in the end, they really did an amazing job. They were good at this. Another example of this competence concept is by a tool that we also used in the Cloetta project. Now, Cloetta was an insight validation project on chocolate, and traditionally what we do there is we ask participants to indicate to what extent they identify with a certain statement. Now, here we even took this to a next level. We didn't only ask this question, but after participants answered to the question, we also showed them the results to that question up until that point. So we showed them a graph like you can see on the screen, and then we asked them, well, can you explain what you see on this graph and can you interpret these results? So we really allowed participants to become co-researchers and think along with us and help us understand the results using their own knowledge and background as a reflection point. And the output of this exercise was really promising because we got 66% additional insights. And the reason is because people are better at predicting other people's behavior than their own. And for example, as a participant, if I would say I do not agree with, I do not identify with the statement, and I would then get a graph like this, I would have to use a projective technique, and I would think of why does the majority do identify with this. And this in the end shows that we used the competence here and that it in the end worked. The third concept to move participants on that motivation continuum is all about relatedness, showing people that people like them are doing this. And this is what the lounge is all about. So the lounge is the most central building in the village. The screenshot is of the lounge of Cloetta. And so here people can give feedback on the survey, they can post topics, they can ask questions to the researcher, questions to the brand, and so on. But the first topic that we placed there is all about creating this conversation starter. And we ask participants when they come on this platform to introduce themselves. We ask them to write who they are, where they come from, what their name is, what their hobbies and interests are. And the interesting part here is what you see is that participants introduce themselves using their common interest and the research topic as one of their identifiers. Now, for Cloetta, for example, people would introduce themselves and saying like, hey, my name is Anne. I'm really a chocolate addict. I eat chocolate every morning, and then in the evening, I also take a chocolate bar to relax on the sofa. And a lot of people would use chocolate in their introduction. Now, you could say, well, chocolate is a very emotional product, And if you think about it, in the end, probably half of you also has some uh, liking with chocolate, but this was also the case for eBay, and eBay is a less emotional product in the end. And what we saw is that also here with eBay, people would introduce themselves using eBay as an identifier. So we talked about autonomy, then we had it about competence, and then I showed you example about relatedness, and then we have the fourth dimension, which is all about value, and it's also my favorite one, and it's showing participants that what they do has a meaning. Now, traditionally in survey research, we do not show participants who the research is for. We do not say who the brand is in the beginning or the product, because of course we do not want to bias the results. However, in the second survey dimension, we did introduce that the survey was for eBay and also for Cloetta. And we also took this to a next level. We did not only share the brand, but we also said to them what the client objectives were. So we said, well, as you might have guessed, this survey is for eBay, and eBay is looking for this. And why is it that we do this? Well, for example, in the lounge, we also asked them to give their advice, and people really like to give feedback. And also because you're transparent, they enter this collaboration mode, and it's really important that participants understand who the final research is for and what the scope is. And revealing this information will show that their opinion matters and will allow them to focus more on the research objectives within their recommendations. And so, for example, also for Cloetta, we had about 80 posts in terms of advice. Another building in the village is the inspiration wall, and this taps in also on that concept of value, showing participants that what they do has a meaning. Now, in the inspiration wall that we use for eBay, we asked participants to give inspirational examples. We said, well, we believe that eBay could learn from you. Do you have any inspirational examples eBay can learn from? And what you see is that participants could upload pictures, videos, and also websites and write about it, how eBay could take this into account. And also in terms of output, this was really, really rich because we got visual content, but also incredible consumer recommendations. Now, I talked about autonomy, competence, relatedness, and value, and the second survey dimension. And what we saw is that 10 to 25% of the people who started the survey, who we recruited for the survey, actively participated in this optional second survey dimension. And if we compare the people who did not go to this village and who did not contribute in this village and the people who went to this village and actively participated, the satisfaction score of the people who were part of this village doubled. So it's double of the people who didn't go to the village. And also in terms of interest, how if the research project was interesting, it was tripled compared to the people who didn't go to the village. So a very interesting finding in terms of participant satisfaction. And what we also saw is that there was an increase of 50% in the extent that people felt that they're understood in the survey. And we did not only make improvements at the participant side, so there was an increase in satisfaction, interest, and the perception of being understood. And of course, we got a lot of data because you ask additional questions in that village, but we also got richer data. We got very inspirational stories, very inspirational output also in terms of pictures, user-generated content that really guide us through our recommendation to build our stories. So I just talked about engaging participants, and I talked about there are 4 dimensions that you can use because before we can capture the concept of engagement, we need to understand motivation. And you go through autonomy, competence, relatedness, and value. Now, the second challenge is to grasp that complex consumer reality in there because in the end, we want surveys to mirror the real world. And there I talked about the social dimension, consumer context, and also that were not rational thinkers, but were driven by implicit behavior. And like the other challenge, I will show you what we did also for both projects. So what we did is we developed a set of tools that tapped into each and one of these dimensions. And in the following, I will show you what we did for social, for context, and for implicit thinking. Now, the social dimension, to just refresh your mind, it was all about that consumers' decisions are taken in a social setting. Now, we don't take that into account in research. And what we did for eBay is we used something that we call the association tool. What we did is we asked participants to write down what they believed were the drivers to buy on eBay. So on the left-hand side, you see these 5 open text boxes. And here's what we said. What do you think are the drivers to buy on eBay? Please use short answers, so 1 or 2 words. After they gave their input, they saw the next screen, so that's on your right-hand side, which is the dummy one, and they saw all the words that other people also submitted. So they saw this word cloud with all the input from their own, but also from other people. And we said, well, this is what also other respondents said. Can you indicate if you see here any other words that you believe are indeed a driver to buy on eBay? So we do not only get spontaneous associations, but also because people can tick the words in the word cloud, we also get prompted associations. And what we see is that the social dimension, so this word cloud, and allowing participants to see what other people have written, that it actually creates this contagious effect. And let me give you an example. So for the same question, 2% indicated that PayPal was a driver to buy or is a driver to buy on eBay. Now, 2% is not a shocking number, and you would say, well, that's a low percentage. But if we then look at the word cloud and the people that indicated PayPal afterwards in the word cloud, that is 52%. Of course, this is corrected because I can also see you think it's corrected to the extent that people were able to see the word, because of course first a participant needs to write down PayPal. Now we also, what you get from here in terms of output is you get the understanding that PayPal is very strong association in a prompted setting. So what does this mean is that eBay can definitely use PayPal in their communication because it might trigger this aha feeling. Yes, indeed, that's a driver to buy on eBay, and might convert people into buying in the end. We also did it the other way around, where we asked participants to indicate the barriers to buy on eBay. And what we got there is that 4% indicated that fake items were a barrier to buy on eBay, and this was for fashion items. Now, again, this was spontaneous, and the prompted here is up to 72. So this really means that in terms of communication, this is really a big one, and that eBay should consider this because it might trigger this aha feeling, and this contagious effect might have an impact whether or not people want to buy on eBay, and also on brand image. So this association tool and this social setting creates this contagious effect that might be interesting in the end to know, because in the real world, as I call it, it's also out there, and it's really interesting in terms of future communication efforts. The next thing that we get out of this social dimension is that we get answers to questions we did not ask. An example is in the lounge. So this is the lounge for Cloetta, and as I mentioned before, in the lounge people can post their own topics. And actually, in the lounge of Cloetta, there were a lot of topics on recipes, their favorite chocolate, and so on. But there was this really interesting conversation going on the effect and what happens if you put chocolate in a fridge. Now, the thing you need to understand is that this survey and this project ran during the summer, so in Italy and in Sweden. And this was in Italy, and people were saying, well, I love chocolate and I like to eat chocolate every day. However, in the summer, chocolate starts to melt. And so what I do is I put it in the fridge, but then you get this kind of like white dust on your chocolate, which is called chocolate bloom. And people were having this whole discussion on whether or not your chocolate is still edible. Now, we didn't ask for this, but we just got this and a whole conversation around the concept of putting chocolate in a fridge. But if you think about it, this is really interesting in terms of future innovations, but also in terms of communications. For example, sharing with consumers that this is just pretty perfectly normal, and also um, giving some background around what is going on. So you get a lot of answers you did not get. You did not to questions did not ask. And another thing this social dimension allows is that participants can about ideas. In the lounge, we also have this room called the Ideation room. And here we post 3 topics, and this was for eBay. And for example, the first one is to optimize their search. And what we ask participants is to think along and create ideas on potential solutions. So, for example, for eBay, when you look for something, there's so much on eBay, and so people are struggling often to find a specific item. So we ask participants to think along and create ideas on how eBay could optimize this. Now, it's not only about posting ideas, but there's also a social dimension into it, because participants can see what other people have written in terms of ideas, they can like it, and they can comment on it. Now you get the snowball because one person starts with an idea and other people comment on it, and you're slowly shaping a whole concept and recommendations. And the output of this is very rich and tangible recommendations, but also what we create are ID cards. And ID cards contain of an ID description, which is your consumer quote, give this ID inspiration, which is a picture. Now, these are interesting things that you can use in future workshops or when you're having strategic meetings. You can see how participants tapped into that solution space and what their ideas are. So when you're discussing future innovations and so on, you can actually put this, and the consumer is basically in your boardroom giving ideas, and you can use this for future projects. So I talked about that social dimension, that it taps into questions you did not ask, also that it has this contagious effect. And now we're going to tap into the dimension of context. Yeah, a lot of decisions are taken into a certain context or situation. Now, what does context do, and understanding that contextual background consumers are in, it explains the why behind the numbers. Of course, quants, we have the quants, so we're not replacing the quants. And the quant is really strong in decision making. So we got really powerful numbers. However, often these numbers raise additional questions, and we're triggered to ask, why is that? Why is this the case? And this is the power of all these user generated content and these contextual tasks. And for example, we have this building in the village which is called the picture shop. And here participants are asked to upload pictures for each task. So for example, for their breakfast moment, and reflect on each picture and write something about it. Of course, the output is very rich. We get a lot of pictures and consumer stories. For example, for Cloetta, we had 217 pictures, and you get a lot of understanding of, okay, this is the context the consumer is in. Now, for example, on the screen you see a lot of pictures that have to do with coffee, so we ask participants about their coffee moment and needing that pick me up, re-energizing. And of course, traditionally you get pictures like at the bottom that you need coffee when, for example, driving, or when you're working late, or when you're studying. But the interesting picture here is the one in the middle, and this was from this Swedish participant who said, well, in the winter, I like to walk in the woods, we go with the family, and afterwards, the most amazing moment is when we come back and we brew this coffee on a wooden fire. And the reason was because it creates this cozy and warm moment. and that it has this link with coffee. And this is also what you see, this coziness is also translated in the picture on the right hand side on top of your screen, and also being together. So important here also in terms of communication potential is that coffee is not only doesn't only trigger that re-energizing, but it also needs to have that warm feeling, that together, that coziness. So also rich in terms of why and getting an understanding of that contextual background. What that contextual background also gives us is giving a face to the numbers, and that user-generated content also does so. Now, on your screen, you will now see what we call trait analysis, and this is how we typically report an InSites validation study. So here you see how the InSight scores and for which target group the InSight resonates better. So how you can see that the InSight score is 97, and the InSight resonates better with kids, with people with people with kids and who are full-time employed between certain age brackets. Now, we also asked participants in the village to create the Facebook page of the typical person that would identify with the same statement. What we saw is we got a lot of output in terms of visual content, also social demographic information, explanations of how that person looks like, what their interests are, and a lot of them came to that same person, and that was a woman who is always busy. She's working full time. Then when she comes home, she has to prepare the meal. She's feeding the kids. She's doing the laundry, doing the dishes, cleaning the house, answering emails, all at the same time. She's this multitasking woman, but the interesting thing here is that the insight was on finding something exciting in chocolate. And what people said is that this woman is constantly busy, and when she has this 5 minutes to herself, she eats this piece of chocolate and she needs something special because that's her me time. That's her only time that she's having for herself, and she's basically isolated from everyone else. And so it allowed us to not only say the outcome from the chat, but also to give a face to those numbers. Another thing what it helps us to do is to better understand target group differences. Now, here you see a tool that we used for the eBay study. It's here we asked participants to visualize their purchase process from start to end. Now, what we asked them is to drag icons representing the platforms or sources that they used, and drag them on that purchase process and on that timeline, and write a description about it. So what they use, why, and so on. And on top, we also asked them to rate the extent to which the source or platform contributed to their final decision making. Now, what you get, this is a really hard exercise, but what you get in terms of output is really interesting and really rich. Because traditionally what we would ask people is, do you use eBay, or did you use eBay? Yes and no. So how many times did you use eBay? What did you use eBay for? And so on and so on. But here we got an understanding of where eBay comes in this purchase process and what the role is of eBay when it's on this timeline. And what we saw is in this research we identified upfront three target groups is that the role of the role of eBay is different for each target group. For example, for one of them, it was mainly in the beginning and used as a price comparison website, while this was totally different for other groups. So I talked about the social dimension in this complex consumer reality. Then we were all about consumer context and this contextual background. And now we have the third dimension, which is that we people are not rational thinkers, but our decisions are automatic, implicit, and emotional. Now, what we did is we used a lot of task-based elements, and the reason why is that we wanted to avoid that recall bias. And let me give you an example. So for eBay, we also asked people to write a review. Now, of course, what you could do is ask people, well, think about your last purchase that you did on eBay and please write a review about it. However, then you have this recall, and you have this recall bias. So what we did is we asked people to think about the consumer electronic item or fashion item that they would like to buy in the very near future. And we said, okay, think about that item, and now let's pretend that you want to buy that item now. So now go to online, go to platforms and purchase websites, go to eBay and write a review about your experience. And what you get in terms of output, you can see an example on the right hand side, is you get really rich and detailed content. And this was really rich, and for us it was really a learning, because you can learn a lot in terms of tangible recommendations, and the output is with visuals but also rich consumer stories. So tapping into that implicit and also using task-based elements in order to avoid that recall bias. But what we also did additionally is we used implicit measurements. So for eBay, we showed every participant a list of statements, and we showed them statements, and each statement was shown for about 3 seconds, and we asked participants to press that spacebar if they felt that statement could be linked to eBay. Now, what you get in terms of output is you get this quadrant. Now, on the bottom, you see that there's the axis that shows the percentage of respondents that agreed that the statement was associated to eBay, so mainly the people who pressed the spacebar. And then the vertical axis represents the reaction time, so when it's high and low, high meaning quickly pressing the spacebar, and low meaning slowly pressing the spacebar. Now what you get is 4 quadrants, and the first one is natural, so meaning a lot of respondents said yes, this is clearly linked to eBay, and the reaction time is really fast, so these are natural associations. Then we have potential associations, meaning that a lot of people associate this with eBay, but reaction time is quite slow, so meaning that if eBay wants this to be a natural association and directly linked to the brand, it should invest in further communication efforts. Then you have the limits, which are also interesting one, meaning that not a lot of people, and reaction time is really slow, so bad in both cases. So it means that if you as a brand have an item in here and you want this item to be associated with your brand, you really have to put in some efforts to move this to the potential or the natural zone. Now, so we got really interesting quadrants that give us an impression of which statements and items are linked to your brand and to what extent, and how we can use that in future communication efforts. But what we also did is we did not only do this for eBay, but we also did this for some of their competitors. And then what we saw is that some of the brands, their items were more, when we put them on the same scales, were more on the right top hand side, and then some of them are more on the bottom left hand side. So what we see in terms of differences is that when your statements are all more on the top and right hand side, it means that the brand image is more clear to your consumers. So also in the end, a new KPI, an interesting KPI was found here. So to wrap up, what did we find and what did we learn in the end from all of this? Well, first of all, engaged participants lead to better and richer data. And in order to understand that concept of engagement, we need to understand participant motivation. And participant motivation is this continuum, and we can use the concept of autonomy, competence, and relatedness and value to move participant motivation on that motivation continuum. Secondly, we need to better understand the complex consumer reality, where we need to take into account that social dimension, the consumer context, but also that we are not rational thinkers, but our decisions are mainly driven by emotions. In the end, from all of this, we got more actionable research. We did not only get the real figures from the quants, so helpful for our decision making, but we got a lot of inspirational output in terms of user generated content that were pictures, consumer stories, but also consumers helped us to create ideas and tap into that solution space to give a richer recommendations. What we also saw is that this new research design had a positive impact on the consumer's brand perception because participants felt that the brand was more open to their suggestions and to their feedback. So if you consider that surveys are in the end another touch point between consumers and brands, this is also an important and interesting learning. I would like to thank you all for listening to my story today.
All right, thank you, Katia, for sharing the story with everyone. I see there are a lot of questions coming through. Let me go to the first one, and it's a question from Roel. He has a question concerning the village. His question is it possible that participants come back to the village? How many people do want to go back after the initial participation? And is that a representative group in comparison with the other participants?
An interesting question. Well, first of all, so we leave the village open for around 2 to 3 weeks, and participants can always come back. Now, what we do is we write newsletters to participants because, of course, when you're the first participant who goes on there, and for example, you come on a launch, it's quite empty in the beginning. So you might need to come back to see, okay, there are now other people who posted something. And so what we do, we write everyone a newsletter to give them some idea on what's going on the lounge or on the village in general. And then we see that a lot of people indeed come back. And in the end, we had 10 to 25% of people who moved on. Now, indeed, what we see is that they're mainly topic, brand, and experience engaged people, people who are more driven by fun and giving their opinion in surveys and less about getting incentivized during surveys. So that's their main driver. Now, what we see with all these people is we can clearly identify who they are in terms of social demographics and also in terms of what they answered in the previous question. And we got a mix here, but they're mainly topic and brand engaged. So meaning, for example, for the Cloetta project, they're mainly people who really like chocolate. And for eBay, they're mainly linked to online shopping and the eBay brand in general. Yeah, I hope
Right.
this answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Katja. Second one is from Astrid, and it's a question concerning the 4 dimensions. So autonomy, competence, relatedness, and value. Her question is there one dimension that has a stronger impact on the motivation than the others?
Well, I have I have no order in terms of impact, what has the most impact, but I think one cannot be done without the other. Because if you say people like you are doing this, this might not be enough. I can tell you people like you are doing this, but then it's not enough. So relatedness is not enough, competence is not enough, showing you're good at this, and autonomy neither. So I think it's integrating all of them that really makes a difference because showing people, for example, that what they do has a meaning, but if they don't see what other people do, if you don't tell them that they're good at this, it doesn't make sense. Of course, we should all try to do as much as possible, but I think the combination of all of them is just what makes sense and that really motivates, moves motivation on that continuum.
Okay, I hope that was an answer to your question, Astrid. And I have another one from Astrid. I can see these kind of surveys work for high involvement topics, but I cannot picture how you could improve motivation or include context concerning low involvement products, for example, in banking.
Well, I don't think it's about the topic only. It's about how you ask questions to people. Of course, I think we have a good example here, and it's the difference between chocolate and Cloetta and eBay. Of course, that's what I said. A lot of people will talk about chocolate. It's a common product. It's an emotion product, but eBay, it's different. And I think this also has to do with banking. So we need to engage people not only on the topic, because the topic, of course, is what interests us, but the way you ask questions, going more to task-based elements and not only asking boring, giving them boring grids. It's about engagement in general. And I think you can do this with both high and low involvement topics and products. I hope this answers your question, and if not, I'm happy to answer it also later on by email.
That's right. I have a last question, but in the meantime, if other people have a last question for Katja, please ask them now, and then we can still answer them in the remaining time. The last question is from Kurt, and his question is, how much time is required in your experience to do this kind of surveys in order to have insightful data?
Is it how much time in terms of analysis, or how long do you keep the lounge open? Maybe Kurt. I will
I
just think about.
think
Yeah.
I think it's more in general, a general question.
Well, Well, how much time? I think the good thing here, I will just answer it in terms of the survey being open into go in terms of like the duration, because in the village, of course, I said about 2 to 3 weeks, and it's really a thing that in beginning you get a lower interaction because yeah, first person answers the survey and then the village, but of course there's this degree where we saw this curve where in the beginning it was quite low, but then when they have this film, you have to understand you come on this platform and in the beginning there's no one there, and then all of a sudden people realize I'm free to post whatever I want, and once one person starts this topic, it's kind of like it keeps the ball rolling, and people are also posting topics, seeing that other people are doing, commenting on this, and I think a duration of 2 to 3 weeks, I think two might actually be enough because it actually takes, I think, 3 days in order to, get enough people on that platform and then they come back and then you really have a big impact because people feel that it's a lot of people are present at the moment and the conversation keeps on going. And that's what you need in order to get a lot of insights because we want that social dimension and we want people to interact because otherwise I think we can just go back to doing surveys as we did by posting questions and waiting for the answer. But I think this social dimension really gives us insights and understanding, and I think that it's about 2 weeks. I hope this might give an answer to you.
All right. Thank you, Katia, for answering this last question. I think we can all agree now that there's definitely a bright future for surveys. I would like to thank you all for joining. We hoped you enjoyed the session as well. And should you have any further questions, you can always send an email to Katia or me, and we will be happy to help you out afterwards. And don't forget, we also always have some Smarties hosting, so just have a look on our website and then you maybe can join later on. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.
Yeah, and also thank you from my side for joining this webinar. Bye.